Hey YouTube, today I'm going to show you how to change a coolant temperature sensor and a sender switch for the instrument gauge in a '96 Toyota Camry. This car uses a 4-cylinder engine and has the 5S FE series of engines. This engine was actually also used in Toyota Avalons, Celicas, and several other engines in Australia as well, and they were used from late 90s all the way up until 2007. So you can use this for any engine that uses the 5S FE series of engines. Here is what a worn out sender switch looks like, and here's what a worn out coolant temperature sensor looks like. Now you might be wondering why you should change this on a car that's got no problems. On older cars, this is very, very detrimental to the ECU. It says if it's a cold start or if it's a hot start, and it tells the engine's ECU how much fuel it needs to dump in depending on the temperature difference between the mass airflow sensor and the engine coolant temperature sensor. If it goes bad, such as this one has gone bad, it'll put too much fuel in, your car can actually sputter and die, you can get bad fuel economy, so on and so forth. Now, older cars also had a separate sender switch, which told the car's instrument gauge what the current temperature was. And if it starts to go bad, you could be getting bad readings on the instrument gauge. And you could be running the car hot when it isn't actually cold, or you could be running the car really, really cold when it's overheating. So you should really, really change this out if you've got no problems. Say you are having problems and you've got a check engine light and you get error codes that says you have a circuit, the engine coolant temperature circuit malfunction. Chances are it's going to be either one of these two, or there's one more sensor that's at the bottom of your radiator. You might have a good shot of changing that out, and that should probably solve the problem. I'll also show you a little bit later how to reset the entire ECU so that the ECU can take a look at the circuitry and make sure that all the problems are gone. So here's what we're going to need for changing out our coolant temperature sensor and the switch. A number 17 wrench, if we're going to be doing this on the 5S FE engine. The 17mm wrench is going to be used for changing out the smaller sender switch, which has a single wire coming out. A number 19mm wrench for changing out the coolant temperature sensor. It'll have 2 wires coming out, and it has a significantly bigger plug on the top. Some plumber's Teflon tape to seal off the threads. I'll show you how to do that the proper way. A tray for catching any coolant that will fall out, and I'll show you the reason why we need to catch any coolant. A few things before we get started. Do not even try doing this if your car is hot, nor if your car is even slightly warm, if you've let it cool down a little bit. You will get some hot coolant on your hands as soon as you unscrew the sensors, because it's right next to the engine block, and you will end up getting burned, because the coolant that you will be messing with really closely is the one that is returned from the hot engine, so it will be significantly hotter than the coolant that goes to the engine to cool it down. So the best time to do this is before you've started your car for the day. Do it like a quick project in the morning. Should take you no more than half an hour from start to finish, and guarantee you it'll be a project well worth it. It should save you easily a couple of hundreds. Now let me go ahead and point out to you what we're going to be messing with first and foremost. I'll give you a better shot. I'll give you close-ups of them as well. This is a radiator cap. We're going to need to take that off to relieve pressure in the system. These two are the sensors we're going to be messing with, and there's a drain cock down at the bottom of the radiator that we're going to have to open up. And the reason we're going to have to open that up is so that we can drain some of the radiator fluid. The reason for draining the radiator fluid is because we need it to drop lower than the level of the sensors, because if we unscrew the sensors as they are right now, we're going to have tons of radiator fluid just coming up right from here, and it's going to go all over our engine, and it's going to make a mess below, and we're not going to be able to catch it nice and neatly. But if we drain it right there from the caulk, we'll be able to catch it in our blue tub, and we'll be able to dispose of it properly, and we'll refill it with some nice, clean, new radiator fluid a little bit later. Now I'm going to show you some close-ups of all this stuff. So make sure you take the radiator cap off. This right here is the drain caulk. When you drain it, it'll end up going out right there. I will show you that a little bit later. This is where our sensors are located. This is the coolant return hose to the radiator from the engine. This is the sensor for the sender switch on the instrument cluster. This is the coolant temperature sensor for the ECU. So for right now, to get started, we're gonna press that little clip and pull the plug up. Just loop it around another cable to get it out the way. Same thing for the other one. Press the little nib at the top, unplug it, and get it out the way. This one, the bigger one, is going to be a 19 millimeter. This one, the smaller one, is going to be a 17 millimeter. I won't be changing that one. I've already changed that one. I'm going to be removing this one, and I'm going to be rethreading this one because I can see a little bit of a coolant leak back there because I forgot to put some Teflon thread on there. So I'm going to be showing you how to do that, as well as changing out, pretty much showing you the procedure for changing out the sensors. Now grab your blue bucket or tub or whatever you're using. Place it underneath the car, wherever your radiator's drain caulk happens to be, or valve. Make sure that your radiator cap is off, and go ahead and start draining some fluid. You'll start to see the fluid level in the radiator drop really quickly, and that's fine. There's no need to panic. Just make sure that you have some brand new radiator fluid on hand, whether it's pre-mixed or concentrate. It's fine, just make sure that you have some, and we'll be refilling the radiator once we're done with everything. So while we've got our fluid draining at the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and at least break the sensor loose. I'm only going to be opening up the sender switch, so that's what I'm going to work on right now. After you've broken the switch loose, loosen it by hand, slowly, just to make sure that no radiator fluid starts leaking out. And that way you can tell if there's enough fluid has drained out of the coolant. Since no fluid is leaking out, I'm going to go ahead and shut the drain caulk at the bottom. On the right, it's the original Toyota part. On the left is the aftermarket part. When you're buying a new aftermarket part, the only thing you need to make sure is the actual thermistor part, which is this part right here, is the same length, because that's the part that's actually going to be immersed in the coolant. The other part that you need to make sure is the threads. That's the part that actually grounds itself to the metal in the coolant return area, and that will be conducting electricity. And depending on how much resistance, electrical resistance, it makes, is how much the ECU, depending on the sensor, or your gauge will actually read, is how hot the coolant will be. So also another thing to make sure is that there's no corrosion. Obviously this one is clean, but in some other cars, such as the northern states where there tends to be salt on the roads, it will cause corrosion, and it might actually spoil the plug that actually sits onto the top of this sensor. Okay, now I'm going to show you how to actually properly seat the threads with Teflon. So grab some of your plumber's tape and wrap it around your finger. Just one loop should be fine. Go ahead, break it off. Grab the sensor. Start laying it onto the threads. And make sure that you don't cover all of the threads. I don't know if the camera's not getting this in focus or what, but just make sure that you don't cover all of the threads. Boom, there you go. Top part's got some Teflon tape on there. Bottom part, you can still see the threads. It's going to make an electrical contact with the thermistor. It's going to ground itself, not short itself while grounding, and it'll give a proper reading. Let's put this bad boy back in. So this should be straightforward. Make sure you hand thread this from the start, because you don't want to cross thread it and strip the sensor. Gently just let it drop in. Lightly start screwing it clockwise. Quick side note. On the 5S FE series of engines, which have a coolant temperature sensor, two things. One, the bigger sensor, which has the two connectors, it will have its own O-ring to seal, so you do not need to use this Teflon tape. Another thing, these sensors on 2001 Camrys, from my recollection, they can be flipped. There sometimes is also a vacuum valve over here. So do not be worried, since mine is just a metal plug sitting over here. So these sensors can be switched in newer versions of the same 5S FE series of engines. But I'm just gonna tighten this sensor back. Do not over tighten it, because you might spoil threads. Once you have it back in there, it's quite straightforward. The green connector goes to the green larger plug. The smaller single wire goes to the smaller single connector. Back in. Now grab a rag. and wipe down any part that might have coolant spilled on it. And here's why. In a few days' time, when you start the engine and you're running it and you come back, pop your hood open, take a check, and make sure that there's no fluid leaking anywhere and there's pretty much no failures of the sensor change that you've done, so that there's nothing wrong with the work that you've done, just to make a double check. Go ahead and take the tub of your radiator fluid out from underneath. Make sure you dispose of this properly. You don't want this to mix with groundwater, especially in my neighborhood, which goes straight out to a giant lake, a freshwater lake. Now refill your radiator with radiator fluid. And once you've done filling up your radiator, and you can actually see some once it settles down into all the grooves and cracks and the air bubbles come out, take your radiator cap, replace it, make sure it's square on there, put some pressure, turn it clockwise, and make sure it's nice and secure on there and it's not going to come off. One quick side note, make sure that you've got a good condition radiator cap, that it's not falling apart. I've seen a lot of ones where as soon as you take the radiator cap off, the tiny little plunger is still in there and it falls in and it's stuck and it ends up clogging the radiator. You can't ever refill it, and the expansion valve and or reservoir is useless to the radiator, and I've seen radiators fail because of one simple bad radiator cap. So make sure that you've got a good, useful radiator cap. Now let's double check all our connections before we move on to the ECU. Our radiator cap is back on. We've closed off the drain cock for the radiator itself. Both our sensors are fully tightened and their plugs are fully pushed in. You'll be sure that they're fully pushed in when you hear a click when they go in. Now it's time to show you how to deal with the ECU reset. This usually clears all the check engine light problems if you're having any, and those usually pertain to the engine circuit malfunction problems. That code usually deals with only 3 sensors if you have an older style car, 2 sensors if you have a newer car. The older sensors in older cars would be these 2 right here that we've messed with, and 1 right down there at the bottom, which I'm going to show you right now. You can see the cable with the red tape going up straight and then making an immediate left. That would be the cable and the wiring for the coolant temperature sensor at the bottom of the radiator. That determines the temperature of the coolant after it's been cooled by the radiator. And in case you're wondering how cooling actually works on this car, coolant goes into the radiator, it drops down using gravity and actually the water pump helping it. Airflow cools it down. These fans also cool it down. This hose right here, it gets coolant pulled by the water pump, cycles it through the water jackets in the engine. The water pump continues to pump it, pushes it through. These sensors read the temperature, thereby determining how hot the engine's running, push it through, and this has the return coolant, returning it to the radiator, and this is usually really, really hot. And when the engine's running and it's hot, this usually will be really, really stiff. As you can see, it's really, really flimsy right now. And it'll be really, really hot and pressurized. And it'll return it. It'll be hot. And as the coolant drops down, it'll cool off and return back. Normally, you can rule out a water pump failure is when the engine's running. If this hose is hot and this one is just warm, normally you shouldn't be able to hold this on for very long, whereas this one you'll be able to hold on to it for slightly a little bit longer, because this one's going to be warm, whereas this one's going to be really hot. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and show you the whole ECU reset part step by step. These ones particularly pertain to 94, 95, and 96 North American Camry, Solara, all styles of the Camry make, because the engine bay layout is pretty much identical. It should also be identical for the 97 Camry as well, if I'm not mistaken. So go ahead, find the relay and fuse panel. Go ahead, pop it open. You're going to find a brown 7.5 amp, a green 30 amp, and a blue 15 amp. Grab the fuse pullers that you're going to find in the cover, stick it on there, and go ahead and yank it. I'm not actually going to do that because I don't have any problems with the check engine light right now. Pull it, set it aside, and leave it alone for right now. We have one more fuse to pull because this is fuse B for the ECU. There's a fuse A as well in the driver's side kick panel. So as soon as you open your door, open your coin tray, pop one tab open, pop the other tab open. It'll drop down like that, and you should be able to just pull it forward. Now, if you're looking at this and you're still dealing with a 94, 95, or 96 Camry, it's going to be that top left one. It's also a 15 amp fuse, and go ahead and yank it out. Now, what you need to do now is stick your key into the ignition. But do not crank it. And then go ahead and wait 3 to 5 minutes. Set a timer if you'd like. Wait out that time period, and then go ahead and replace fuse B, then replace fuse A. So imagine we've replaced fuse B over here. You can go ahead and snap this in, push that in, and click. We go ahead and put fuse B back in there. So what that does, it ends up putting power back into the ECU circuit and wakes that back up. But it had removed power for about 3 to 5 minutes, thereby resetting its memory. And now as soon as we crank the engine, after waiting those 5 minutes and putting the fuses back in, as soon as we crank the engine, it gives the ECU a chance to re-diagnose the engine as you drive it along. And it should take 10 to 15 minutes of driving for the ECU to diagnose the engine, check out all the electricals, timing, etc., to figure out if there's any more problems going on, coolant issues, cooling issues, any other failures, which hopefully there shouldn't be any. You should have solved the problem by now. But if there are any other error codes, you've pretty much ruled out the fact that your sensors are the cause of the problem, because you switched them out and you put in brand new sensors. There they are, all shiny and new. There's nothing wrong with them. So hopefully that took care of your problem. And if you guys need help with anything else, feel free to post a comment or send me a message here on the YouTubes, and I'll be more than glad to help you guys out. Hope you guys could use this tutorial to save yourself a ton of money. I know it did for me. I freaked out when my instrument gauge decided to just jump straight to hot when my sender switch decided to ground itself and fail. So I'm happy it works now, and I learned something from scouring the internets.